Hi, and welcome to the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. In its fourth season, the series is the flagship community educational outreach program at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. The series brings together thinkers and performers from the Sunshine State and around the nation to engage in discourse and debate in the spirit of the French salons of the 18th century. Beacon College is America's first accredited college or university dedicated to educating students who learn differently. But foremost, Beacon is a rigorous liberal arts school ranked by U.S. News & World Report as a top college in the southern region. The Salon Speaker Series honors the college's duty as an institution of higher learning to uplift the community, spark engagement, and sow seeds of conversation and discovery. In this installment, we'll revisit a horrific moment in history where terrorism ruled the skies. On June 14, 1985, TWA Flight 847 was hijacked by Muhammad Ali Hamadai and a second terrorist brandishing grenades and pistols during a routine flight from Athens to Rome. Over a horrific 17 days, TWA pilot John Testrake was forced to crisscross the Mediterranean with his 153 passengers and crew members from Beirut to Algiers and back again, landing in Beirut 3 times before he was finally allowed to stop. The terrorists had tied passengers up and were beating them, threatening to kill them unless hundreds of Lebanese were released from Israeli prisons. But that's only half the story. Then there's the story of pilot Richard Vaux, whose employer, World Airlines, asked him and a crew to sneak into Beirut, Lebanon at the height of a civil war to reclaim the plane that became TWA Flight 847. It's the story that Brad Kuhn tells in his book, Dirty Work, the untold story of the secret mission to steal back TWA Flight 847 from Hezbollah. Kuhn is the author of 10 books, including 4 of his own and 6 as a ghostwriter. A former newspaper reporter for the Orlando Sentinel, his first novel, Mr. Bones, won a Royal Palm Literary Award from the Florida Writers Association. He's a founding director of the Jack Kerouac Writers and Residence Project of Orlando and currently resides in Jacksonville with his wife, the writer Darlyn Finch Kuhn. Together, they run the Jax by Jax Literary Arts Festival, an annual celebration of writers and writing in Duval County. Please stay with us after his talk for a Zoom webinar where you can hear him answer questions. Now, the Beacon Salon Speaker Series is proud to present Brad Kuhn.
In 1985, Islamic terrorists from Beirut, Lebanon, seized TWA Flight 847, demanding that Israel release Palestinian prisoners. In 2016, a group of ranchers from Bunkerville, Nevada, seized a Park Service outpost, demanding the surrender of federal lands. The 2 standoffs happened 7,000 miles and 30 years apart, but the road from Beirut to Bunkerville is shorter than you might think. Let me explain. Both were desperate acts perpetrated by desperate people who resorted to violence because they felt powerless and oppressed. In both cases, things got out of hand and people died. This isn't a political rant. I'm here to talk about my book, Dirty Work, the story of a secret mission to steal back TWA Flight 847 from Hezbollah. But it's important to know that while the events in this book took place long ago and far away, the forces that set the story in motion are still at work today, here at home as well as abroad. Our story begins on June 14, 1985. It was a sunny morning. TWA Captain John Testrake was going through his pre-flight checklist as passengers boarded his 727 for a 2-hour flight to Rome. Summer Mediterranean routes in Athens, Rome, and Cairo were plum assignments reserved for TWA's highest-ranked pilots. Flights were short and the scenery gorgeous, and the crew was often home in time for dinner. The manifest listed 139 passengers, including Greek pop star Demis Roussos, celebrating his 39th birthday. Most of the passengers were tourists. A majority were Americans, and as were all but one of the crew. 2 days earlier, a Jordanian airliner had been hijacked by Lebanese terrorists on departure from Beirut and blown up on the tarmac after all the passengers were evacuated. The hijackers were protesting Palestinian occupation of South Lebanon. Passengers were quickly rerouted to other flights, including Middle Eastern Airlines jet, which itself was hijacked by a Palestinian gunman in retaliation for the earlier hijacking. Testrake had heard of the incident, but hadn't paid much attention. His flight plan would take him nowhere near Lebanon, and he was preoccupied with plans for a Greek islands cruise to celebrate his 8th anniversary with his wife Phyllis. Beirut was a hot mess, but all of that was far away, until a man holding a grenade in one hand and the pin in the other stormed the cockpit and demanded that Testrake reroute the plane to, you guessed it, Beirut. This man and his accomplice were part of yet another militia called Hezbollah, which roughly translates to Party of God. The militia, formerly known as the Islamic Jihad, had recently rebranded under a bright yellow flag featuring a green fist clutching an AK-47. A little backstory. Lebanon has only been around as a country since 1945. It was created along with Syria, Jordan, and Israel out of land seized from the Ottoman Empire in World War I and managed for 30 years by Allied powers under a League of Nations mandate. The creation of Israel was particularly problematic because the Allies had originally promised the land to Arab Palestinians as an incentive to get them to rise up against the Ottomans and fight in World War I. Bitterness over this betrayal is still fresh in the hearts of millions of Palestinians who were driven from their ancestral lands by Israeli defense forces armed and trained by the United States. A majority of those displaced people ended up in Lebanon, which had its own problems. Assassinations were common as various factions battled for power, and in addition to the Lebanese army, which functioned as a private security force for the president, the Speaker of Parliament, Prime Minister, and even the Justice Minister maintained their own private militias, which were constantly jockeying for power with and against each other and against other militias. By the summer of 1985, there were more than 20 different militias operating in and around Beirut, many of them from temporary shelters erected around the airport, where they could pass the time between formal attacks shooting at each other. To make things even more confusing, these militias were constantly forming and dissolving alliances with other countries and religious groups and other militias depending on who they were fighting at any given time. In 1982, Israel, tired of constant attacks from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, an alliance of militias operating out of southern Lebanon, they staged a full-on eradication campaign with the help of Syria and some sympathetic Lebanese militias, driving the PLO and its leader Yasser Arafat out of Lebanon and into Libya. Western powers, including the United States, sent a multinational force to help keep peace, which made the country's Christian president happy, but angered a loosely organized group of Shiite extremists backed by Iran and Syria who opposed Western occupation. It was these militants who bombed the U.S. Embassy in April '83 and blew up a U.S. Marine barracks in October of that same year. President Ronald Reagan announced the withdrawal of U.S. forces on February 7, 1984. On the 8th, he unleashed the big guns of the USS New Jersey, firing 300 shells, each the size of Volkswagen, into the Bekaa Valley east of Beirut. Hezbollah officially went public with a manifesto in February of '85. A few weeks later, a truck bomb that many attributed to the United States exploded near the home of Hezbollah's leader, killing 80. That summer, Hezbollah embarked on a wave of hijackings with the aim of winning the release of hundreds of Palestinian Shiites held in Israeli prisons. Depending on who you talk to, they were either aided in those efforts or expertly managed by Lebanese Justice Minister Nabi Berri, leader of the Amal militia, who entered hostage negotiations in the case of Flight 847, supposedly as an honest broker, but ended up taking control of the plane and holding the hostages in various undisclosed locations around Beirut after the original hijackers shot Navy diver Robert Steedham and threw his body on the tarmac. It could be argued that this transfer took the hostages out of harm's way, but it led to speculation that Barry may have been the brains behind the entire effort, especially considering that he let the original hijackers go instead of holding them accountable. Barry's dual role as government official and militia leader created other challenges as well. For example, after the hostages were released after 17 days in captivity, he ignored TWA's overtures about getting their plane back until President Reagan agreed to lift a US-led ban on passenger flights in or out of Beirut International. Barry's permission meant that he wouldn't stop TWA employees from boarding the plane, but he could not guarantee that Hezbollah or one of the other militias camped out around the airport wouldn't shoot the plane out of the sky or blow it up on takeoff. With that in mind, TWA approached the recovery effort as a clandestine op, working with the U.S. State Department and the Department of Defense to protect the crew as much as possible, while at the same time denying that there was even such an effort in the works. Dirty Work is the story of Captain Richard Vaux, a 21-year TWA veteran pilot who volunteered along with First Officer James Corley and Flight Engineer Carl Salon to fly into Beirut at the height of the Lebanese Civil War on a repo mission that could very well have gotten them killed. Captain Vaux hired me as a ghostwriter to help him tell his story, and later gave me co-author credit in exchange for helping to get the book published shortly before he died in 2019. He told me a lot of interesting stories in addition to the one I'm going to read to you today, and they're in the book. I'm going to read several passages, skipping some of those other stories to focus on the main event, which is what you all no doubt came to hear. The flight to JFK takes a little over an hour, leaving me just enough time to sprint to Ed's office in Hangar 12, where I meet my crew, First Officer Jim Corley and Flight Engineer Carl Salon. At the top of the meeting, Ed swears us all to secrecy. I say, "What's so secret? You want us to go pick up a plane?" He looks at me and he says, "Well, technically, the terrorists still have it." My heart skips a beat. Oh, that's nice. Ed tells us that some friends at Middle Eastern Airlines, MEA, the Lebanese flag carrier, have been maintaining the plane for us and helping us find a relatively safe extraction opportunity. TWA kept an Irish crew on standby for a couple of weeks after the hostages were released, but scrapped that plan when it became clear that the airport was under a permanent state of siege. The FBI, CIA, and the State Department brief us. They emphasize the importance of secrecy and warn that if we even tell our families, it could ruin the peace process. No pressure there. I ask about contingency plans. We're going to be flying over the Mediterranean. What if we get shot down? Or lose an engine? Is there going to be a ship or something that we can aim for so that we can get picked up? The answer is no. Our flight to Athens leaves at 7 p.m., so we've got a few hours to reflect on the risk we're taking and everything that could go wrong. We're all retired military, but it's been a long time since any of us has done anything that would qualify for hazard pay. We're about to leave the hangar when Ed chimes in with one final instruction. "I want you to go in wearing TWA uniforms," he said. I shake my head. They've just finished scaring the daylights out of us. Now he's saying he wants us to go in flying the TWA flag. I'm generally not one to make waves, but this is a bridge too far. I stand about 1.5 feet taller than your average Middle Easterner, so I figured the scrambled eggs, the leaf cluster decorations in the middle of my cap, would fit real well in a sniper's crosshairs. Ed explains that if we're taken prisoner, the best chance of survival is to be clearly identified as TWA employees. Otherwise, we might be shot as spies. I'm not sure what would stop a spy from dressing like a pilot, but I don't press the point. I agree to carry my uniform and change into it once we're on the plane. By the way, the Ed we're talking about here is Ed Stroshine, the Director of Flight Operations for TWA at the time. Falling back on my military training, I spend the afternoon writing letters to my children, words of love and inspiration to fill the gap, and provide at least a small measure of solace in case the worst happens. The exercise puts me in a somber mood as Jim, Carl, and I make our way to the gate to pick up our tickets for the first leg to Athens. It's a relief then when Corley, upon discovering the company has booked us economy class, demands and receives first-class upgrades. We may be going on a suicide mission, but at least we're going in style. We arrive in Athens a little before noon and grab a bite before our next briefing at 2. For something that's supposed to be so hush-hush, there sure seem to be a lot of people who know about it. I count 16 of us in the briefing room, CIA, State Department, you name it. Most of the top brass at the airline is back home in New York, fending off separate hostile takeover bids from Frank Lorenzo and Carl Icahn. But other than that, we've got everyone's attention. We go over the plan again, perfection through repetition. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., we'll fly to Larnaca, Cyprus, where Middle East Airlines officials will brief us before we transfer to MEA, the only commercial airline that still offers passenger service in and out of Beirut. It's a short hop, less than half an hour each way. Our handlers want us in and out in an hour. An hour is a tight turnaround, even under perfect conditions, and there's no way of knowing what we're going to find. Our friends at MEA assure us that they've been taking care of our plane, flying it regularly, but they won't let our mechanics look it over. And from the pictures I've seen, it hasn't moved in 2 months. A guy from the State Department gives us a rundown on Beirut International. The runways are new, replaced since the Israeli Defense Forces attacked the airport in '82 and again in '84. The terminal building, however, is still under repair. There are 26 different militia groups camped around the airport who spend their time firing their weapons at each other and randomly into the air. There is no border fence keeping these folks or separating these folks from the airport. We're reminded that our presence is a closely guarded secret and that our safety and the safety of others depends on maintaining that secrecy. Media coverage is a real sore point with these guys, and although I have no intention of talking to any reporters, I'm half tempted to do it just so I can say that someone should have warned me. We are told again that we are on our own and that if anything happens, the government will disavow any knowledge of our actions. That's not the answer I want to hear. I'd gladly trade a few of these guys in suits for even one guy in a wetsuit. We arrive in Larnaca the next day at 10 a.m. The MEA station manager meets us outside. The militias are shooting, so we have to scrub for the day. We'll regroup at the same time tomorrow and see how it goes. Not the best news, but certainly not entirely unexpected. Worst case scenario, I figure we'll spend a few days in Larnaca and get called back home. The station managers saved the worst news for last. They know you're here. News travels fast in this part of the world, and apparently someone didn't get the memo about the whole secrecy thing. We don't want any trouble, so we've arranged for you to stay at a resort on the north end of the island for your safety, the station manager said. I catch Jim's eye. For your safety is what the hijackers said to Flight 847 hostages before they were separated and transferred to secret locations. A long gray Mercedes limo pulls up. The driver gets out wearing a white turban, white cotton pants, and a long linen tunic, the current fashion for Turkish Muslims on the north side of the island, who had seceded in 1983 and declared their independence from the Christian Greeks. He is not smiling as he comes around and opens the rear passenger door. I've traveled extensively, and I've never considered myself particularly prejudiced. But after 2 days of listening to the State Department drill into our heads how much the Muslims over here hate Americans, my imagination is working overtime. I duck my head and step into the limo. I can't help but feel like a hostage. None of us are armed, another precaution intended to distinguish us from U.S. intelligence. Although, even if we were, I'm not sure it would do us any good at this point. It's a long way to the north side of the island, maybe 2 hours. Our driver can't speak English, but he does eventually smile, and as the kilometers click away, I allow myself to relax. a little. We pull up to this magnificent hotel. We're the only guests. That doesn't make any sense. August is one of the busiest months in the Greek tourist season. I suspect it has more to do with the Turkish occupation. 20 staff members greet us, men dressed in long white robes and turbans. Jim starts whistling Hotel California, and I elbow him in the ribs. We rise early the next morning. Those same 20 men are lined up with white towels draped over their arms like French waiters. The hotel kitchens are closed, we are told, so breakfast is soft-boiled eggs. Just eggs. After breakfast, our driver is waiting to take us to the airport. We bid goodbye to our hosts and settle in for the long ride. In Athens, we're supposed to report to the chief pilot, but the office is empty. I see a guy in an MEA captain's uniform, and I ask if he knows the captain we're looking for. He says no and continues walking. I tell him we're trying to get to Beirut. He ignores me. We follow him anyway. When he finally speaks, he tells us the media have been sniffing around all day. He warns us not to talk to anyone and takes us to a holding area in the back to await boarding. The waiting area is like a corral, a fenced-in area packed with women and children. Evidently, the people of Beirut come to Cyprus to buy food they can't find back at home because of all the shortages. The chairs are positioned along the containment fence, so we're all sitting in a circle looking at each other. Everyone's talking in Arabic, but now and then I hear one of them say, American. The word spreads around the room, and pretty soon everyone is saying it. They're all looking at my flight engineer. We were told to wear casual clothing during this phase of the operation, to blend in and avoid drawing attention. Jim and I look like tourists in our khakis and loafers. I look over to Carl, and the light reflecting off his shiny government-issued black cordovan shoes almost blinds me. You could see your face in them 100 yards away. American indeed. I roll my eyes and lean in close to him. Nice shoes. Where'd you get them? Americans are us? Carl considers my comment for a second, and I can see his jaw clench. Sorry, Cap, he says. Nothing we can do about it now. A disheveled guy in a rumpled jacket hobbles over with his arm and leg in casts. He's not wearing press credentials, but he's got a camera and a massive lens strapped around his neck. Captain, are you going to Beirut? We're in the holding area reserved for the next flight to Lebanon, and I tell the guy, no, I'm not going to Beirut. You're going to Beirut, he says. I know you are. And I ask, who the hell are you, and why do you care where I'm going? He says, I got friends at the State Department. We turn our backs to the guy so he can't get a clear picture of our faces. The room is buzzing with everyone whispering, American, American. I'm on high alert now, scanning the room. Everyone is watching us, and I'm waiting for somebody to make a move. I'm starting to see terrorists behind every pillar. I've got to get a grip. A woman in a headscarf approaches. She has a brown paper cylinder under her arm. The woman shambles across the room, bent and feeble. When she gets up close, however, I can see that it's all an act. She can't be older than 35. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me. Are you going to Beirut? She asks. Again, I lie and turn away. It's becoming my go-to move. I hear the woman shuffling away and turn to watch her go. From this angle, I can see a logo printed on the brown paper. It says NBC News. The MEA pilot opens the door, and a ground crew rolls out a set of stairs. No jetways here. 2 uniformed militia members ride in on the platform, each armed with a machine gun. The pilot steps out of the plane and motions for me to follow. Jim and Carl are right behind me, but the guards close ranks. Just you, the pilot says. They'll come along later. The pilot disappears into the belly of the plane to retrieve a battery, leaving me alone with all of these machine guns pointed at me. I take in my surroundings, the blown-up terminal, my plane, the unusual assortment of fuel trucks I take in my surroundings, the blown-up terminal, my plane, the usual assortment of fuel trucks, tool sheds, and maintenance hangars. I can't help but feel a prickle of apprehension. As if on cue, all hell breaks loose. Out from behind every single building comes a vehicle, and every vehicle has at least 10 guys with guns hanging out of it. They're all wearing military uniforms, but the uniforms vary from vehicle to vehicle. One group's wearing camouflage, and another silver tans, and another group is wearing dark jumper pajamas. These are all civilian cars and trucks, vintage, and some of them are tricked out. I'm a car nut, and I swear one of them was a Pontiac Grand Prix. The trunk lid is up, and there are 8 guys standing in it, firing their guns in the air. I count somewhere between 15 and 20 cars. Everybody's shooting and yelling, and I'm yelling back in 3 languages that I don't speak Arabic, and thinking this is the end of my life, when a little guy appears out of the center of the group and everything goes quiet. He's about 5.5 feet tall, all dressed up, spit and polish. He's wearing a gold and tan uniform with stars running all the way up one sleeve, around his collar, and down the other sleeve. He's got a bunch of medals, but no other clear sign of rank that I can identify. I have no idea how to handle this situation, but I'm grateful that the shooting has stopped, so I snap to attention and pop him a salute. The little general salutes me back and says in heavily accented English, "Are you the captain?" "Yes, I am." He says, "Welcome to Beirut." Damnedest welcome wagon I've ever seen. The welcoming committee disperses, driving off in different directions, leaving just the 2 of us. At his signal, the guards at the top of the stairs let Jim and Carl out, and we all walk to our plane. There are armed guards surrounding the 727. That seems like overkill. The plane's been sitting there for 2 months. They know we're here to take it back, so I'm not sure why they need to make such a show of force. As we walk across the exposed ramp, however, it occurs to me that how vulnerable we are out here, and what an MEA official said about militias firing at each other. I realize that all of this, the guards on the roof, the guards at the door of the plane, and the Mad Max welcoming committee, is an effort to protect us. Maybe. When we arrive at the plane, the aft air stairs are down, allowing us to board without waiting for another roll-up. We're each assigned our own bodyguard. Mine is a nervous 14-year-old kid with a pistol in one hand and a machine gun in the other. I'm not sure who he's supposed to be protecting, but it's my head at which he's got the pistol pointed. Jim, Carl, and I had briefed on how we were going to handle pre-flight. In addition to the usual items on our checklist, we had separate lists of things that we want to investigate. 2 of our biggest concerns are sabotage and explosives. We realize that there's only so much we can check, and that even a small aneroid bomb programmed to explode under cabin pressure would mean game over. In this regard, we catch a bit of a break. The plane, after sitting in the desert for several weeks, is evenly coated with a visible layer of fine golden sand. On the one hand, this tells me there's no way that MEA has been maintaining the plane as we've been led to believe. On the other, it gives us an easy way to check for sabotage. As we fan out to look for potential problems, I tell the guys to pay special attention to any areas where the sand has been disturbed. That's not going to help us for anything left behind by the original hijackers, but you do what you can do. I asked the general if it'd be possible to locate a cherry picker. He nods and says something to one of his lieutenants in Arabic, and a few minutes later, here comes this bucket lift, hell for leather, kicking up dust. I jump in the bucket. They crank me up and take me all over the airplane. Nothing has been disturbed. Next, we examine the wings. On a 727, you can run the flaps down without the engines on. That exposes all of the wing structure. I ask Carl to drop the flaps, and we have a look up in there, taking a little extra time in the wheel wells, which strike me as a logical place to hide a bomb. I draw the short straw and have to inspect the baggage holds. Inside, I find the rotting remains of all that fruit that the hijackers requested. It's more than 100 degrees in here, and I can't even begin to describe the stench. I'm in there slipping and sliding around in all of that mess, moving these big metal cargo plates to check underneath, trying not to fall. It's all I can do not to throw up. Even so, I inspect every inch. As much as I want to breathe fresh air, the prospect of possible bombs keeps me laser focused. I recorded Captain Vaux talking about that experience shortly before he died. This was just days before he passed away, and he wasn't at his best. I watched him decline precipitously over several months, so this clip is hard for me to watch. It's the first time I've ever shared it with anyone.
They had all their army troops, and when we were on the ground there, that general came up, I spoke to him, and all the people came out of all the cars over. I said, why are the welcoming committee this size? He said, well, there are 27 different factions here. And he says, everybody wants to be the boss. I walked in, and the cockpit was, of course, the bullet hole where they'd killed that poor Navy guy was right there on the floor. And one of my contentions was that they said they've been flying that plane every day waiting for us to come in and fly it out. I went to get in the cockpit, and the captain's seat has that U to bring the yoke back. The right-hand thing is bent in and touching the other side. You couldn't pull the yoke. You couldn't have flown that plane. You couldn't have done anything with it. So they were just basically lying on that. They didn't fly that plane every day the way they told you. That plane was never flown. So I got down, put my feet against the base got on the other side, and I started pulling. I used every ounce of strength I had, and I was finally able to bend it back so I had clearance to bring the yoke back. Otherwise, you never could have raised the nose of the plane to leave. Number 2 radio, they'd spilled enough coffee and fruit juices and stuff on it. It was all cemented. I tried tuning it. I broke the knob right off the thing, trying to tune the radio. So the floor was covered with bullet casings where they'd been firing for test strike and all that. I worried about the condition of the airplane if it had been booby-trapped, because we didn't know what to think. That was one of the things I asked for when we first got there. I spoke to the little general. I said, you've been here, the plane's been here not a long time, but long enough a couple of weeks. How about a cherry picker, a lift? And get that, you want a okay. Showed up, had a driver on it, ran me up so I could look down and get a sky view of the top of the airplane, because I figured if you looked down and saw the surfaces, the wing surfaces, the tail surfaces, it was all kind of gold dust that had blown in each day. I said, if they disturbed anything, you'd see it. And if they tried to clean it off, you'd see the dust was missing. But it was even as can be. So I wasn't concerned when it came down. But then we lowered the flaps and everything we could operate from the cockpit with a switch, electric switch. I ran the flaps down, checked the actuators, leaks, any problems or any strange objects, nothing. So we were happy with that. The funny thing is, when I left, of course, we went over got on the plane, went through all the protocol, signed all the paperwork. Guy shows up in the cockpit, and he's got a sheaf of papers about this thick, about an inch thick a size. I had to sign everyone as the official representative from TWA. Well, I mean, he was so thankful. I'm reading down, rental, ramp space, 1 day, $2,000. I said, I probably signed for $500,000 worth of rental. When I signed those papers, I said, I got back to the States, they're going to put me in jail for spending all this company money.
The clock is ticking. We're all painfully aware that we're working in a very tight window and that the militias can start shooting again at any minute. We complete our checklist in what feels like a lifetime but is actually less than an hour. We get the radio working and request clearance from the tower. This gets a little sticky as they clear us above 30,000 feet and I have to push back requesting a lower altitude without broadcasting my reasons for not wanting to pressurize the cabin. We're fairly certain there aren't any bombs, but we didn't have much time and I want to keep us within breathing range to avoid setting off any pressure-sensitive ordnance that we might have missed. Someone at ground control must have finally had their coffee kick in. They radio clearance at 10,000 feet and clear us for takeoff. I switch on the auxiliary power unit, turn the ignition button to start, and offer up a quick prayer to the God of Super Bowls and good fishing before moving the fuel control lever from cutoff to run. Beirut Tower has cleared us for takeoff on runway 18, which, according to my paperwork, should be a short taxi to the left and a right turn for takeoff. For some reason, the tower instructs us to take a more circuitous route. They direct us to a taxiway on the western fringe that isn't even listed on my 1983 Jeppesen Airport guide. This takes us way out in the boonies, literally off the charts, and I assume outside the range of our rooftop protectors. Carl takes inventory of the various lights and gauges on his engineer's console. In what strikes me as almost miraculous stroke of good fortune, everything seems to be in good working order, except for a slight rhythmic pulse that seems to sync with the tires crossing the expansion joints in the concrete. Jim and I are getting the same anomaly on our gauges, but it doesn't seem to affect the plane's performance, so we make a note of it for maintenance to check it out later and agree to ignore it for now. Our takeoff heading will take us right over a cluster of those A-frames that I noticed on the way in. Taking the assistant chief pilot's warning to heart, I decide we need to get airborne early and out over the Mediterranean before anyone has a chance to take a shot. The 727 has a clean wing, no engines hanging off of it. My plan is to rack it up and cut a hard left, almost dragging a wing in the dirt as we cut between two buildings and straight up into the sun. I tell the guys to brace themselves. We're going out fighter pilot style. We're taxiing very slowly with all this unprotected area between the water and us. The terrain is undulating sand dunes covered with wild vegetation, perfect for an ambush. The side windows of the cockpit double as escape hatches. There's a rope in the frame that you can drop down the side and slide to safety. I tell the guys that if we're hearing shells hitting the plane, I'm going to shut it down and we're going out on the ropes. We're getting near the end of the taxiway when a guy in the tower starts shouting, "TWA, TWA, take off immediately, take off immediately." Apparently the militias have started shooting at each other again. I don't have enough taxiway to take off, so I floor it trying to get to the next turn as quickly as possible. I cut into that 180 that'll get my nose pointed north, scrubbing the desert-baked tires on the concrete until I'm afraid they'll pop. We come shuddering around the corner and I'm getting ready to give it the gas when all of a sudden this armored personnel carrier comes flying out of the pucker brush. It grinds to a stop by my window, and there's a guy on the roof with a twin-barreled 40mm cannon pointed right in my face. I look behind him, and there are 4 other guys, all with automatic rifles. The control tower is still screaming for me to go, and I've got this guy threatening to shoot me if I do. I try to explain my situation to the tower. "We've got ourselves a little Donnybrook here," I said. Based on the angle, these guys are invisible to the tower. The plane provides them perfect cover. "There's no truck," says the tower. "Take off." Out of logical options, I fall back on the tried and true. Remembering how I'd calmed things earlier with a show of respect, I slip on my captain's hat and poke my head out the window. In a repeat of my previous performance, I pop a military salute and hold it. The guy with the 40mm returns the gesture. His friends follow suit. So we're sitting there saluting each other, and I think, well, now what the hell am I going to do? I've got a tiger by the tail. Still holding the salute, I motion with my other hand for the driver to back up. If I can get enough distance, I plan to hit the throttle and make a run for it. To my surprise, the driver complies. I hold the salute until I know I've got clearance for the front landing gear. I tell my guys that we may not make it. I think of the letters I wrote to my kids before we left. Then I jam the throttles forward and slam the window shut. We go screaming down the runway and nobody seems to be following us. As soon as we're up to speed, I pull back on the yoke and turn it sharply to the left. If anyone is shooting at us now, I can't hear it over the roar of the engines. Up, up and away, out between the buildings and into the blue. The interior may not win any beauty contest, but I can't help but be impressed with the way those engines are running after being neglected for so long. With the auxiliary power unit sketchy, I decide to leave the landing gear down. That limits us to a maximum speed of 250 knots, less than half of normal, to keep from ripping the hatch doors off. I level us out at 10,000 feet for the 25-minute flight back to Cyprus. Everything else seems to be running normally except for that rhythmic pulse in all the gauges. This is very unusual because there are 3 independent power systems feeding into the panel, and yet all of the gauges are in sync. We run various diagnostic routines, cycling through all of the power systems, but again, we can't seem to isolate the cause. Approach control in Larnaca clears us to land west of the terminal and instructs us to taxi to the bomb de-arming area. Not an encouraging sign. We pull to a stop way out away from the terminal, and all these emergency vehicles come racing up. TWA's chief of maintenance for all of Europe has flown in from Paris, along with a demolition expert out of Tel Aviv. They roll out the stairs and enter the cabin. I open the cockpit door to watch them work, trying to pick up on any tricks I might have missed. Pretty soon, it can't be more than a minute or two later, I hear those whop, 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 whop. I step out onto the platform and there's this massive helicopter, a big Chinook with a rotor on each end. There aren't any official insignia, but I can tell from the blue and gray that it's U.S. Navy. The pilot puts it down, nose to nose with us, so close that the blades are almost hitting the cockpit. I hear another one right above him. The side door of the Chinook on the ground opens, and all these guys come pouring out. Navy SEALs, in full battle array. There must have been more than 30. They've got masks, guns, Mae Wests, everything. They all jump out and give us a big thumbs up cheer, and then they climb back inside and take off again. The other Chinook never lands. I guess that sort of thing is done on a need-to-know basis. The fewer people who knew of their movements, the better, and thank God there had been no reason for us to know until we needed to know. After all those statements to the contrary, it felt good to know that Uncle Sam had our backs the whole time. The maintenance guys had barely finished their search and given the plane a clear bill of health, except for a new .40 caliber bullet hole in the tail. When we get word through the station manager that the bosses back in New York have called to complain that we're running late and to urge us in the strongest possible terms to hustle our corporate assets on to Rome. I tell the maintenance team about the pulsing gauges. They agree that it's odd, but we're cleared to fly. It's 2 in the afternoon and beautiful as we enter the home stretch, lifting off with a full tank of gas, making the left turn for a scenic 3.5-hour pleasure cruise over the Greek islands and around the boot of Italy to Rome. When we arrive at Fiumicino Airport, it's the same song and dance. Hip, hip, hooray! Proceed to the bomb de-arming area. After they look us over, we're directed to the TWA maintenance shed, it looks like a giant Maine chicken coop. This time, however, when they roll up the stairs, instead of Navy SEALs, there's a guy on the platform in a cheap suit who demands that we relinquish the plane. I politely decline, explaining that we're under orders not to hand the plane over to anyone other than an authorized TWA representative. He flashes a badge and explains that he's with the FBI. I explain to him that that's not how you spell TWA and point to the Greek flag flying over the terminal. You're a little out of your jurisdiction, aren't you? This is not what he expected to hear. The agent gets so red in the face, I'm afraid his head is going to explode. He pulls back his jacket to reveal his sidearm, a Model 13 Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum. She's all yours. I pack up my headset and bid our plane arrivederci. Jim, Carl, and I still have a telephone debrief scheduled with the board, and then it's off to Rome Hilton for a few stiff drinks by the pool. Only one challenge remains. Between the hangar and us is a phalanx of about 40 reporters. They're coming at us in a headlong rush, like a porcupine bristling with microphone booms. We collide head on. The news people are pushing and grappling, peppering us with questions. There's one guy noticeably shorter than the rest. He's schlepping a battery pack and has wires sticking out of him in every direction. He's very polite and he is asking some very nice questions. I try to reward his good manners by offering him a quote. Just as I do, however, the crowd surges, knocking him down. As he goes down, one of those wires catches the wings on my shirt, tearing a hole. I bend over trying to get the wire off, and the crowd sweeps over us. Down I go. The Italian police come crashing in a flying wedge and knock everyone on their butts. We're all sprawled like upended turtles on the ramp, and I look at Jim and Carl, who are on the ground next to me, trying to recover their stuff and get back to their feet. This strikes me as incredibly funny, and pretty soon we're all laughing. Once we've managed to regain our footing, I lean in close and say, "Open field running, boys. Let's go for the touchdown." We sprint for the building and lock the door behind us. So I'd like to close with this. There's a story elsewhere in the book where Captain Vaux talks about how his father had told him that he was so lucky that he could fall down an open manhole and come up perfectly clean in a brand new suit. And that's important to understanding the callback here at the end. A policeman friend of mine once described his job as hours of boredom punctuated with moments of sheer terror. Carl, Jim, and I managed to survive our moment of terror and settled back into, I wouldn't say boredom, but back into the comfort of our daily flight routines. Weeks after we turned the plane over to the FBI in Rome, my phone rings in Danvers. It's the chief of TWA's maintenance operation in Kansas City. Dick, he says, you remember that problem you reported with the gauges? Takes me a while to put that in context. You mean on the flight out of Beirut? Yeah, that's what I'm calling about, the Beirut flight. I wanted to tell you how lucky you are. I tell him the thing about the suit in the sewer, and to his credit, he lets me tell the whole story before bringing the conversation back around to the reason he called. That's pretty lucky, but do you want to know how lucky you really are? He definitely got my attention. I had my best guy on it for 2 weeks, Dick. I'm telling you, he pulled out all the fuel cells. Every connection on that plane has been taken apart, cleaned, polished, and put back together again. We were totally stymied. I'm pacing back and forth, stretching the phone cord to its limits. Enough preamble, just cut to the chase. Well, about an hour ago, we're sitting here drinking coffee and staring at this stupid thing, and we've got all the cowling off and all the wires are exposed. The 727 wiring harness runs along the keel of the plane, under the fuel tanks and up under the cockpit where it branches right and comes out of the wall behind the engineer's panel. Well, we were looking at those wires, which we'd checked at both ends, he said, and then my guy says, I know this is stupid, but the only thing we haven't checked is that big clamp that's holding all those wires together at the middle. The clamp to which he's referring is 5 inches wide and looks like a hose clamp on a car, only bigger. It has 4 big bolts that cinch it down. There was zero chance that this was going to make any difference, the maintenance guy says, but we'd tried everything else. So my guy loosens those nuts, and when he's opened the clamp, boom, all those wires just fell to the ground. They'd been cut and bolted back together so we wouldn't notice. We replaced those wires and problem solved. My knees turned to jelly. I have to sit down. I guess somebody figured that they'd vibrate loose somewhere over the Mediterranean and he'd fall out of the sky. For once in my life, I don't know what to say. Well, I just figured you'd want to know, Dick. I thanked the maintenance chief and hung up the phone. The likelihood of what he described, that the wires could be severed and reassembled in a way that allowed them to function, and then that connection would hold over 3 takeoffs and landings in a transatlantic flight, is a unicorn event. Imagine someone with a severed spinal cord taping it back together and running a marathon. For a moment, the thought is overwhelming. I picture that little general racing up to the pearly gates with a cherry picker and making me sign an invoice for 3 caskets and a funeral director. When faced with one's own mortality, I guess it's only natural to freak out a little. I allow myself to think about the finality of death and all the things I still want to accomplish. And then I pack all that up and put it away with all my other close calls. Yes, I could have fallen down that open manhole, but I didn't. I lived to fight another day. I pour myself 2 fingers of bourbon, neat, and raise a glass to my old man. I think I'll buy a new suit. So that's my story. I've thought about turning it into a screenplay, but it's a bit convoluted and there are a lot of questions I've never been able to answer, especially regarding the exact role of Nabi Berri, who would go on to become the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament, a position he holds to this day as well as still leading the Amal militia. The hijacking of Flight 847 is one of the longest and most public hijackings in aviation history. And while it had a tragic ending for Navy diver Robert Steedham, it could have ended much worse. This hijacking has been the subject of 2 movies, Delta Force and The Taking of Flight 847, starring Lindsay Wagner, and several books, mostly written by the passengers and crew of the original flight. This is the only accounting to date of the recovery of the plane, which, is a footnote in the bigger picture. We live in a noisy world, and with everything coming at us all the time, we don't often stop to put things in context, and that was my goal here today. I hope that you will buy my book, Dirty Work, which is available through Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook. But more than that, I hope you'll take the time to look for the stories behind the stories in big events like this, and imagine the motivations of those involved on all sides, and think about the conflict that might have been avoided, as this one most certainly could have been. The road from Beirut to Bunkerville is shorter than you think, and recent history has shown us how quickly America, for all of our wealth and privilege, can devolve into tribal conflict. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have in the live Q&A coming up next.
Thanks, Brad, for sharing that fascinating if little-known nugget of history and heroism. You'll get a chance in a few moments to dig a little deeper into this subject and hear a little more in our Zoom Q&A. But first, we want to share a little bit about Beacon College and what we humbly call the Beacon difference.
In just over 30 years, Beacon College has become a place with a distinction unmatched by much older institutions. Entrepreneurial and accessible, Beacon provides a rigorous undergraduate education that changes lives and alters the trajectories of young men and women. Nestled in Central Florida's beautiful Lake County, Beacon College is part of the growing community of Leesburg. Our campus reflects the aesthetics of a friendly downtown, nearby beautiful lakes, all while being part of the booming economy of Central Florida. Near Orlando and the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, Beacon is well situated to many 21st century industries that tap Beacon talent for internships and first careers.
We have an individualized approach that we take with all of our students, looking at their needs, their schedule, their plan of study to help them to identify the steps that they will need to be successful. We help them with life coaching in terms of time management, stress management, anything that would become a barrier to their academic success. Our learning specialists are working with those students to break down those barriers, to make them more available to learn the things that they need for their career.
Beacon continues to garner heightened national attention and accolades. In short order, Beacon College has become the leading college for students with learning differences and attention issues.
We focus on executive functioning skills, social skills, emotional regulation skills, in hopes that we can remove a lot of the barriers that impede on the initial successes of our students when they come to Beacon College. So we don't wait to work with students when they step foot on our campus in August. We are actively working with them before they even get here.
With such small class sizes, I learn who my students are very quickly, and more importantly, I can identify when they're having problems. So instead of waiting weeks or never for them to get the help that they need, here it allows me to be very proactive in giving them the help that they need, even if they don't even think they need it.
At Beacon College, we work with students to turn learning challenges and differences into assets. Our faculty and staff excel at helping students boost critical thinking skills, shine academically, understand their learning differences, and discover ways to thrive with them.
At Beacon, I learned how to learn. You figure out what's your learning style, you figure out what works best for you. I would be lost without Beacon College, and we're doing great. And I was so worried I wasn't going to.
When I see that light bulb go off after weeks of struggling and they finally get it, that's pure joy.
Many of our students wanted to learn, wanted to excel in academics, and unfortunately with their learning disabilities, that's held them back. What we strive to do is find out what it takes for them to learn that topic. As soon as I take the anxiety off, a lot of the needs that they thought they needed, they don't need anymore. And it brings the joy of learning back into it.
Beacon's now international reach uses a global canvas to paint a world for students in which their abilities are no longer limited. Unlike at any other academic community, students with learning differences thrive at Beacon College. In a high-tech world that often feels more distant and remote, the Beacon experience for students is high-touch. Whether engaging faculty in the classroom or meeting with learning specialists, career educators, or our counselors, students thrive pursuing an undergraduate education designed around their learning differences and being part of a community skilled at nurturing their differences as the gift that they truly are.
Over 70% of our students graduate with a bachelor's degree within 4 years. If you compare that to the national graduation rate for students, it's closer to 39%. So I think that's remarkable for this population of students that really struggles with learning. So it means that the supports we're giving them, the resources that we provide, we're accomplishing our goals because we can see them progress each step of the way and move towards graduation and internship and a job.
Beacon was the one college that had built-in support where they helped you to identify what you needed and then helped you to address the problems.
But we were just so grateful that we were able to find Beacon.
If your child has a learning difference, this is the place to be. This is the only place to be.
But after you leave Beacon College, I guarantee you will be able to have the tools in order to succeed in life.
Unique programs and a faculty and staff dedicated to student success, the Beacon difference is the thread woven throughout the fabric of this very special community.
For more information about Beacon College, visit our website at beaconcollege.edu. Now it's about that time. And tonight, as usual, we have Joe, our AV wizard, running the board and fielding the questions. But first, let's welcome Brad Kuhn.
Hi, Daryl.
Hey, Brad, good to see you this evening.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I'm going to issue a disclaimer right now. Brad and I have known each other for a number of years. Way back in another life, he and I were both journalists at the Orlando Sentinel, so I figured I hadn't seen him for a while, so why not invite him to be a speaker in my series, right?
We're also old prison buddies.
You weren't supposed to share that. So I'm going to look at Joe to see if we have any questions before we get ourselves in further trouble this evening. Well, so far, folks, let me remind you that you can write your questions in the Zoom boxes, and Brad will be happy to answer them. But we'll get started by me, I guess, stirring the pot a little bit. So, Brad, we heard in your presentation about how you came to be involved in this project. Before he had reached out to you, was this a piece of history that you were familiar with?
Only vaguely. I was familiar, obviously, with the hijacking. This was actually the very beginning of what you all may remember as Reagan's Arms for Hostages deal. This was kind of Ollie North working in the background. You had Robert Bud McFarlane involved in the background, and you had the President Ronald Reagan was talking about, no, we don't negotiate with terrorists, but you had a bunch of American lives. Remember, Jimmy Carter had a debacle with hostages, Iranian hostages, and Reagan didn't want to be in the same kind of situation. So there was a lot of pressure on him to have these hostages released. So I kind of knew that part of the history. But to be able to have this privilege of meeting Captain Vaux and getting his history, and it may seem like I read all the book, but there's a whole lot of other little stories from his life. It was just, he had an amazing life with a lot of adventures, and this one is the central thread to the story.
Okay. Do we have any questions yet, Joe?
We do have one question from Adam and Monique. They were asking about the film possibilities. I know you mentioned that, but they were asking if you were considering getting an adaptation greenlit for a feature film.
Oh, I would love to. You know, as I mentioned, I think in the presentation, the challenge here is that a lot of the folks that were part of this have passed on, or their memories aren't that good. I'd kind of, you know, I know that Adam and Monique Madrid are both very talented filmmakers. They're people I happen to know personally. And I would love to work with them or some people that are more experienced than I am at doing film adaptations, so that we could figure out what's relevant and what's not and turn this into something wonderful, because there certainly is a lot of action, but making it a compelling movie that kind of follows a coherent plot it could be a little challenging. The answer is I'm trying. I've struggled with the screenplay myself and would love any expert advice from anybody out there that could help me make it coherent.
Well, share with us, Brad, a little bit about the writing process here. Now, as we mentioned in your bio, that you're also a novelist. So can you compare and contrast the process of writing a novel versus writing a piece of historical nonfiction?
Yes. Good question. Thank you. This was much more like going back to the newsroom. This is long form journalism for the most part. You have a central character with a central perspective, one perspective on the story, and then you kind of have to flesh that out and verify it, kind of triangulate in on the truth, because we all, you know, history is sort of formed by perceptions, and we all have our own version of it. And so especially when you're dealing with a pilot like Captain Vaux, you know that pilots have a tendency to embellish and become grandiose. And when you combine that with the aging process, you know, I had a real duty to the reader as well as to the captain himself to try to get beyond the barroom bluster that accumulates over the years as the story grows and grows and grows, and ground it back to its journalistic kernel of truth, and then surround that with the context of the time so people could understand why somebody would hijack a plane, what was going on, and why an American plane. Was it just coincidence that it was American, or was there something unique about America that made this plane a target? And so that's what I tried to do, was within the rest of the book that we didn't talk about today kind of gives us some slices of life into the captain's life that brought him to that point. So I basically in the book tried to combine my novelistic skills of multiple plot lines, bringing the captain up to the present, and bringing the America up to the present, and bringing TWA to the present. So in the whole book, I kind of tracked the thread of TWA and its corporate takeovers and what put TWA there on that tarmac at that time. And then I had to bring, the captain and his mindset that made him volunteer. And then, of course, we had to kind of figure out why the hijackers did what they did. So you're kind of combining those novelistic skills in the ability to weave multiple narratives with the single point of view of journalism and the research of journalism.
We have another question from Marguerite. She asked, how did you meet Captain Vaux and come to write his story?
I got to write this book because I row boats, which is kind of a weird thing. It's just like the kismet of the story itself. I am a competitive rower to do crew. And one of my rowing teammates knew Captain Vaux, grew up in New England, and knew of this guy and his family and his story. And he knew that the captain was getting on in years, and the family was concerned that his story would never get told. And so as we got to know each other, after I moved to Jacksonville, he came to believe in my storytelling abilities, and he told the family. And they contacted me and hired me to write his story. And then I think, as I mentioned, as he got older and it became clear that he wasn't going to be able to be around to go through the traditional formal publishing process, I stepped in and actually helped get the book published and produce the audiobook and the Kindle myself, which is what I do as kind of a day job, is help authors get their books published as well. So that's how it came about. It was purely coincidence, and as so often happens in life, I was really lucky, and he was really lucky, and we came together at a moment in time, and I really feel blessed to have been there at the end to make sure that he actually got a hard copy of the book the week before he died, and the first 3 people to buy it and have him sign it as the author were his hospice workers.
Wow, that's incredible, Brett. Well, let me ask you this. I remember reading in the research for this presentation a 1985 AP story, and where Captain Vaux had safely returned the plane, and he ran into the original captain of the plane, whose name escapes me unfortunately right now.
John Testrake.
Thank you. And he runs into him and says, "Hey, I brought your plane back," basically is what he says to him, which I thought was pretty funny. But I'm wondering, did those two strike up any kind of relationship in the aftermath of that?
I asked him about that, and they really didn't. They hung in different circles. To be honest, Captain Vaux was a bit of a rake, and John Testrake was a devout Christian man. And they ran in different circles. And John Testrake died not too long after that of cancer. So they worked for the same airline for a long time, and Testrake eventually kind of retired and moved on, but they didn't really hang out together.
I see. That's too bad. But I guess these things happen. Even though history brought them together, they couldn't keep them together. So,
I will tell you that Testrake volunteered for this trip. Testrake actually volunteered. Was one of, they had dozens of pilots that signed up to volunteer to get this plane back. It was a matter of pride among the senior pilots at TWA, and the airline said, "No, John, you've kind of done your time. Taking a gun to the head is pretty much all that's required of you."
I would tend to agree with that. Well, back I guess in the 70s and maybe a little lesser in the 80s, these plane hijackings were kind of the flavor of the day. You almost seem to hear about them at least once a month or whatever. But that kind of tapered off, I guess. And then we had 9/11. And I'm wondering, did you ever have a conversation with Captain Vaux about that situation and his feelings about 9/11?
We didn't talk about 9/11 specifically, but I will tell you that he was involved in another situation in Tel Aviv, which a lot of people may have heard about, where the Red Army, which was actually an affiliate of the PLO, it was like a Japanese splinter group of the PLO. And they smuggled weapons in musical instrument cases into the baggage claim area of Tel Aviv airport. And Captain Vaux and his crew had just barely beaten. There was this weird jockeying for position. They had both taken off from Rome at the same time. This Air France plane jumped in front of them in the line and went and was going to take off first, but the control tower or ground control called them back and let Vaux take off first. Well, because Vaux took off first, they landed in Tel Aviv first, got through baggage claim, and were on their way to the bus when all hell broke loose behind them, and several people died because these people brought out machine guns and hand grenades and blew up the baggage claim in Tel Aviv. So he had his own, he had his own firsthand terrorist experience. But by 9/11, he was kind of out of the airline business.
I see.
And we do have not a question, but Margot, Dick's daughter, chimed in and saying that they are happy that you're able to share their dad's story and get it published. And they say, well done.
Oh, well, thank you, Margot. You and your family have just been so good to me. And it's an honor. It really is. Thank you. You know, I did remember a 9/11 story, not a 9/11 story, a World Trade Center story. When Dick came back from this mission, he was given, he and the crew were given a President's Award, which was the highest civilian honor that TWA gave its pilots for this recovery effort. And they were treated to a big soiree at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. And Dick took his son, Glenn, with him, and they went to the top of the World Trade Center. And they've got pictures, and I think I've got one of the pictures in the book that Glenn took of them, the two of them, on top of the World Trade Center. So, you know, you actually have this view of a pilot who's involved in this terrorist situation standing on top of a building that was eventually blown up in a terrorist attack.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Well, let me ask you this, Brad. Have you kept a running interest in this case? Because as I understand it, the hijackers, or at least several of them, remain at large, and the FBI has $5 million rewards out for them for any information on them. I wish I had some information, by the way, but I don't.
You know, it's funny. I don't. My current rundown on the hijackers themselves is a little fuzzy. I believe that at least one of the original two hijackers had been caught. There was a recent situation where the Greek police picked up one person they thought was involved, but they determined ultimately he was not, and they let him go. There was you got a lot of media coverage up front about the arrest, but not quite as much as kind of a little brief about him being let go. So, you know, part of the problem, as I mentioned maybe in the story, is that the Amal militia, which Nabi Berri ran, and it was at the very beginning of that, Hezbollah was just forming, and the Amal and Hezbollah were both Shiite militias, and they had to kind of come to an uneasy alliance. And so he was trying to thread this needle between looking out for his neck as a rising young political aspirant, and the more radical needs of Hezbollah. So I think there was some horse trading that went on, and he kind of let these guys go on purpose to save face with Hezbollah, so that to kind of further his own career. And then he ended up holding on to the hostages himself to finish the negotiation, to kind of give these guys what they were looking for, without harming any more hostages. Because, you know, the first two got crazy, got a little bit heated, and killed Robert Steedham, the Navy diver. And at that point, it was kind of like, yeah, we've got to get these hotheads off of here. But obviously, they weren't held to account.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for sharing that, Brad. This has been a fascinating conversation this evening, and a fascinating read. Would you please remind our viewers where they can get your book?
Oh, yes. My book is available in paperback, Kindle, and an audiobook on Amazon. And yeah, so go buy it, and appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, I heartily recommend you guys do that. So, Brad, it's great seeing you again, and thank you again for the enlightening presentation this evening.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you for Beacon College and what you guys do there. The whole neurodiversity issue is tremendous, and what you were able to accomplish with students and the opportunities you give them is fantastic. Good luck to you and Beacon.
Thank you very much, Brad. And so we thank you this evening for watching and joining us for this latest edition of the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. And we invite you to come back next month on February 23rd, where we will be featuring Dr. Christina Proenza-Coles in her presentation, American Founders, How People of African Descent Establish Freedom in the New World. That should be a very compelling subject for Black History Month. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I'd like to thank the Lakefront Television crew and my AV staff, Joe. And again, thank you for watching us. I'm Daryl Owens. Have a wonderful evening.